Hello everyone, welcome to another Animation Friday. I apologize, this video is being uploaded late. I was unfortunately busy. Sometimes these things happen where I'm not able to upload the videos until the next day as opposed to the day when they're supposed to be uploaded. So it might happen sometimes, but I always catch up and I always end up posting the videos that need to be posted. So without further ado, let me discuss the three big, or really the three players of animation that exist today. This includes DreamWorks, Disney Animation Studio, which it was actually renamed, so right now it is called Disney Animation Studios, and Pixar. These are the three big companies that pretty much dominate the realms of animation these days, and they are the ones that are producing the films for our youth out there. Now, DreamWorks actually started in the 90s. They did make 2D animated films, for example, Prince of Egypt, Road to El Dorado. Those films were 2D. Their first film was actually Ants, which was computer generated. It was very strange. They went from computer generation to 2D animation, and they kind of played around with 2D and 3D for a while. That's what makes kind of DreamWorks a little interesting, is that they started out with both. They started out trying to incorporate both because both were still sort of popular during the time, which was within the 90s and then in the early 2000s. So they did have a lot of interesting projects, but then once 3D took over and was completely the dominating thing, they dropped 2D animation completely. And that was probably within the early 2000s. I think once Shrek got fairly popular, I think their 2D probably was not there anymore. And now, just so anybody knows the difference between 2D and 3D animation, 2D is hands and pen and paper and pictures. 3D is computers, so you do everything on the computer. So in case anybody doesn't know the difference, but that's really what ultimately ended up happening with DreamWorks. They're a very interesting company because initially they didn't have an animation department. Like, DreamWorks was around way before their animation, but eventually they did end up having, I guess, a significant amount of chunk of change to make an animation studio. So it's kind of like a subdivision of their whole brand, so to speak. But they do have a really nice, logo with the boy on the moon, and it's very childlike, and all of their films have varied over the years. I think usually people like to think of DreamWorks as the kind of, they're the alternative to Disney, but at the same time they do kind of embrace similar kinds of, methods, and they kind of do try to, please the crowd, so to speak, at times. Are they bad in any way? No. But I think usually their films maintain this level of standard where it's hard for me to distinguish which ones I actually like the most. And I did address this briefly in one of my other videos where I was trying to figure out which DreamWorks films were my favorites, because a lot of them are kind of on the same even playing field. Oh, and I should also mention too, they also actually utilize stop motion animation, which they did for Wallace and Gromit, as well as Chicken Run. So just in case anybody is confused on that, they did utilize those things too. I don't think they utilize them as much though. Primarily 3D is their main focus because they know their target market does like everything computerized and digitalized because we live in such a computer and digitalized world. It only makes sense that kids would gravitate towards 3D animation. So that's really DreamWorks' company in a nutshell and what it offers. I think over the years they've done some very interesting work. Um, and they seem to be the one company that has remained stable. Like they don't seem to have like a huge growth spurt where they were on top, like they were the top dog, but at the same time they maintain this level of consistency. Like it's DreamWorks, you know what you're gonna get. It's kind of predictable in that way, and some people might find that refreshing because oh, I know what to expect when I go and see this film. I expect it to be good, or I expect it to be DreamWorks, and I think they maintain that standard level, and they like that level, and they're comfortable with it. Are some of their films not as good as others? Yes, of course, I think that you can make that argument for some of their films, but I think they seem to maintain this level of standard. Like they don't seem like um they had really up and downhill moments. They've been kind of cruising ever since they kind of got started, I think. Were at points they were a little bit more popular? Yeah, maybe so, with films like Shrek, who made a lot, which did make them a lot of money, so. And there's other films that have made them a significant amount of money too, but at the same time, I think they kind of cruise. They're the cruisers of animation. They'll go in and they'll make something, and you'll know it'll be good, but but there's no point where they have this huge pinnacle peak of greatness. It just seems to be, it's just a standard. They just have their standards and they kind of stick with them. And I think that's what a lot of people like about DreamWorks. They don't try to push the envelope that much, but at the same time, they don't try to, um, they don't take, I think, as big of risks. But I think that's sort of a good thing because they know what they're good at and they stay at that. And I think they've known how to do it maybe more so over the years um, than before. But again, they've had flops over over the years too. So, but I think overall it's just kind of been a cruise. They just kind of, it's like little waves, but nothing really pinnacle. And probably the closest pinnacle is Shrek because that is heavily merchandised. That is heavily marketed as the DreamWorks' big favorite. So again, I think it only makes sense that they would be more of a, because they know what their audience wants and they maintain that level of we're gonna give that to you. So they don't. Again, I don't think they're big risk takers. They're not. They just don't operate that way. Whereas Disney Animation Studios, on the other hand, has had a very, very long history compared to DreamWorks, which just started in the 90s. Disney actually did start in the 20s by Walt Disney and his brother, and it eventually grew into this big, gigantic empire that we see of today. But this was a struggle. This was a really an uphill battle. This was not easy, especially considering the fact that animators didn't have the same amount of technology, the same amount of influence within media that it does today. It was probably a very difficult time, especially when there were people that were trying to steal ideas from you and so yeah, getting the first really big animated studio company started probably wasn't the easiest thing. So there were definitely a lot of hills and valleys for Disney over the years. But I would say once they started out, they did grow to that big level that we see of within the 40s and the 50s. And then as the 60s came along, it was a little bit more downhill, and then, and 70s too, and 80s. But then until we get into the 90s, that's where it's kind of all really good and really, really, really strong. And then we kind of go back down to the early 2000s where it's not really all that well anymore. And then we go up to now, which is where they're making lots and lots of money on these movies. Tangled made a lot of money. Wreck-It Ralph made a lot of money, and so did Frozen. So it only makes sense that they have a huge history. They have a huge amount of growth and decline. It's seen, leaders sort of rise and kind of fall due to death um, or due to maybe a lack of leadership or purely incentivized through gaining cash as opposed to making quality. So yeah, Disney has seen its good times and its really bad times too. Whereas DreamWorks, I think they've I'm sure it was an uphill battle for them too to get started, but I think they've maintained this kind of level of where they can kind of cruise, especially when they are sort of under DreamWorks. I mean, DreamWorks is still pretty big, so if you're DreamWorks Animation, yeah, you're in a good place. But I mean, Disney was pretty much through all of its, it wasn't owned by anything. It was all on its own out there. So it did have a lot of significant impacts and then a lot of flops. They did start again with 2D animation, which was the majority of their lineup until we got into the early 2000s where computer generation was becoming a thing. And again, this is when Disney did take over Pixar. This is when you started seeing, other animators kind of coming in and, getting the rope in as far as incorporating 3D animation with 2 Disney animation studios lineup. Because before then they were all only doing specifically 2D, and that was eventually dying. And it all started because of Toy Story, because of the technology. It's just people were just going into the digitalized direction, and and buying out Pixar was a really smart move from Disney to do that, because now they've got somebody who can kind of help them out almost. And then they released their first 3D film, Chicken Little, which did not hold up all that well critically, although I think it did make still a significant chunk of change at the box office. But it was really on a downward slope because the studio didn't really know how to adjust itself properly into 3D animation, I think. And that's where it kind of struggled. And that's when Pixar sort of took over and said, yeah, we'll just do all of your animation now for you. we'll just become we'll just be like your DreamWorks animation, because again, Disney, since Disney became a company that was just became more about different things as opposed to just the animation, like focusing on the parks and focusing on merchandise and all that other stuff. Again, they kind of lost sight of the animation, I think. So that's when kind of Pixar took over and started changing things. Now, I'll discuss Pixar after this, but I just want to say that once Pixar started putting itself and make it its mission to kind of revive the studio, that's when you see eventually Disney starting to kind of eventually get out of the sort of slump that they've been in. Because I think they still had a heart for 2D animation. They still wanted to have that be a part of them, which they did try to do with The Princess and the Frog. And they tried to do it with Winnie the Pooh. But unfortunately, it didn't work. as well as they thought it would. Um, because again, kids wanted computers. And when you look at the box office numbers between Tangled and between Princess and the Frog, you'll see what I mean. And when you look at the box office numbers for Wreck-It Ralph and Frozen, you will see the common pattern: CGI equals more money. And so that's what they ended up doing. And I think the studio is at a point right now where it is not going to go back to traditional animation. It is going to purely stick with 3D from now on. And I think it's unfortunate because I do like the artistry and the effort and the time that goes into 2D animation. But I understand, that if your market is telling you this, you have to go with the market. It's only logic. It's how business works. You go with what the logic is, even if you don't agree with the logic. It's like, yeah, I'm gonna go with this, even though it's all math. So again, I think we've seen them kind of trying to rise up from that slump. They made a lot of money ever since then, and they've been making a better quality, I'd say, too, than when we're seeing Pixar actually right now. So they kind of gravitated upwards. Even though I think Frozen is not that great of a film, I will acknowledge that these other films that they tried to do, like Wreck-It Ralph and Tangled, are actually, I think, genuinely really good. And, their quality, I think, has gone up there than it was in the early 2000s. Not even, like within all of the 2000s, they were really struggling. And then now to see them at this pinnacle where they are today, I think that's a good thing. It's nice to see that it was always about the animation. It's nice to see that thing is kind of back, and that it's stronger than it was before. And that, I think, is a good thing. Even if I don't like some of the films, I still think it's a good thing. Because again, I think still a majority of what they're making is good quality. I'm not saying Frozen is bad quality, but it's not, I think, as good as the other films that they've made through this period. And again, it's only been a short period, so we'll probably never know what the future will hold for Disney. And if they do try, and I think doing a Frozen 2 is such a bad strategy. But if they continue on this high rise, if they continue on this, they'll probably make good money and make the level of what they were doing in the 90s, which is probably where they want to be, because that was a really high time. And the 50s too, they want to be at that high rise. I'm just hoping that the sequel of Frozen doesn't destroy that. That's my biggest fear, is that will destroy the potential that Disney had to come back again. So yeah, but that's basically where they're at. Now Pixar, again, was bought out by Disney, started really in the 90s. I think it had a lot of influence from Steve Jobs in particular. Since he's a computer whiz, only makes sense. But again, Pixar, unlike the other studios that I've mentioned, they've never done 2D. They've never even touched 2D. All of their films have been 3D, consistent throughout. And they started really high. They started really good. You had Toy Story. You had all these other great films that were coming out from them initially when they started off, like Monsters Incorporated. They were starting off pretty strongly. In a similar way how Disney, once they got themselves up into making animated films, were strong and did really well. However, I think once we started to get into maybe Cars, that's when things, I think, started to kind of go a little bit on the A side for Pixar. This is when I think Pixar started to kind of not try. I think this was the point where, and I think too, really, if you look at after Brave, I mean, what did Pixar do after that? It has been pretty much, from what I've seen, Planes. They made a sequel of Planes. you know, um, I guess they're trying to come back. I think with their, I believe Pixar is doing the one film where they're like all these different like emotions and stuff. I want to swear it's Pixar or DreamWorks. I could be wrong though. But from what I could tell, there's really not a whole lot going on, unfortunately. As compared to the earlier 2000s and the, you know, mid to late 90s, they were getting up there and they were getting a lot of money. And I think Brave did make them a lot of money, but as far as quality is concerned and sort of relevance, I think started going down once we saw Cars come out. And then we got to Cars 2, which was like, why? Why did you make that? And then we started to see, DreamWorks kind of coming in and, making big money, and, winning some awards too. I mean, they even initially still won the first animated feature film, so award from the Oscars. So, I mean, it just only goes to show that, that, even if you do start out strong, there's always some kind of fall period, or especially if you have um, grander ideas. I think Pixar was that kind of company. They and still are. I mean, in certain respects, but I think people who vision big, and they're kind of down to earth, sort of, you know you could say like the kind of down to earth hardworking people. Um, and that's kind of showcased within their films, sort of too. But they had big dreams and they had big ideas, and then once that energy is used up, it's hard to find, especially when too, there's people who are either leaving or retiring, or there's big shifts that need to be made. It's hard to maintain that level of greatness, and then it eventually falls a little. And I think Pixar is at a downward spiral right now. I mean, I don't know what they're making anymore. Ever since Brave, I haven't heard of anything else. I've heard of Planes and a sequel to Planes, but beyond, and then maybe possibly in a film about emotions, may or may not turn out good for them. I haven't heard much, so it doesn't seem like they're putting in a whole lot of thought, or they're just throwing out really bad ideas or not as good ideas and then waiting to climb themselves up again. But I think what's happening right now is as Pixar kind of goes down, Disney is going to rise. But it's going to be a question of, is Pixar going to pick it up again? Or are they just going to kind of stay? And is Disney going to rise, or is Disney going to fall? And then you got DreamWorks in the middle, just going, we're just cruising. Yeah, we'll win an award. Oh, okay, we'll get nominated. All right, yeah, we'll just cruise. Uh, so yeah, those are really the three big animation companies right now, and it can go in any direction, and it's really fun to watch. It's really interesting to watch, actually. I think out of all companies to watch that are interesting to watch, animation studios are, in particular for me, fascinating to watch, because it's just interesting to see how they change over time, and how their product changes over time, and how their business changes over time. And you can clearly see how these studios kind of branded themselves. You see what they are and what they've become over the years, and I think it's a very fascinating look. Um, and yeah, I think that's really though all I can ultimately say about this topic. I think it's very fascinating, and it's cool to see who's doing well, who's really not doing anything, and seeing what ultimately will happen, because we're at a really interesting stage right now. Because again, computers have only been around for so and so much time, so it can go in all kinds of directions. So yeah, I think that's really though ultimately all I can say about this topic. But if there are any questions, comments, concerns, be more than happy to answer them. But thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.